The lonely price of consciousness. Why the most evolved men walk alone. There's a devastating truth that Carl Jung discovered about psychological awakening that no one talks about. The more conscious a man becomes, the smaller his dating pool becomes, until eventually he may find himself completely alone, not by choice, but by psychological necessity. This isn't about being picky or having high standards. It's about a fundamental incompatibility between awakened consciousness and the unconscious patterns that drive most romantic relationships. Jung's clinical observations revealed that men who had done deep psychological work often found themselves in a painful paradox. The very growth that made them more complete as individuals made them increasingly incompatible with partners who were still operating from unconscious psychological patterns. This shocking reality began to emerge in Jung's practice during the 1920s, when he started noticing a disturbing pattern among his most psychologically developed male patients. These weren't bitter misogynists or social failures. They were accomplished, emotionally intelligent, spiritually aware men who had done years of inner work, integrated their shadow, developed their anima, and achieved what Jung called individuation. Yet despite their psychological wholeness, or perhaps because of it, they found themselves increasingly unable to form lasting romantic connections with the women they encountered. Jung's investigation into this phenomenon revealed that awakened men face what he termed the consciousness gap, a psychological chasm between their level of self-awareness and the unconscious patterns that most people, including potential partners, were still operating from. When a man has spent years examining his motivations, integrating his emotional complexity, and developing authentic self-expression, he becomes acutely sensitive to the unconscious games, projections, and compensatory behaviors that characterize most romantic interactions. Have you ever felt like your personal growth has actually made dating more difficult because you can see through the surface-level interactions and psychological games that most people seem to accept as normal? The first reason Jung identified for why awakened men often remain single was their inability to participate in what he called unconscious romantic projection. Most romantic attraction, Jung observed, was based on projection, people falling in love not with who their partner actually was, but with archetypal images they projected onto them. Women might project the father archetype, the hero archetype, or the anima figure onto men, while men projected the mother archetype, the maiden, or the anima onto women. These projections created intense initial attraction, but inevitably led to disappointment when the real person failed to match the projected fantasy. Awakened men, having done the work of withdrawing their projections and seeing people as they actually are, found themselves unable to participate in this unconscious dance. They could see when women were relating to them as projected archetypes rather than as real individuals, and they couldn't reciprocate the projection because they had learned to see beyond surface presentations to psychological reality. This created relationships that felt hollow and inauthentic to the awakened man, even when the woman was genuinely interested and attracted. Jung discovered that awakened men also struggled with what he called the caretaker trap, the unconscious expectation that masculine energy should provide emotional, financial, or psychological caretaking for feminine energy. Having done their own inner work, awakened men could see how many women were unconsciously seeking a partner to heal childhood wounds, provide emotional regulation, or fill psychological voids that could only be authentically filled through individual development. These men found themselves unwilling to enable psychological dependency, even when such enabling was socially expected and rewarded. The second major factor Jung identified was the awakened man's relationship with his own anima, the feminine aspect of his psyche. Men who had done deep psychological work had typically integrated their anima, developing their emotional intelligence, intuitive capacity, and receptive qualities. This integration made them more psychologically complete, but also less likely to seek external feminine energy to compensate for their own undeveloped feminine side. Unlike unconscious men who were driven to find women to complete them psychologically, awakened men were already complete and were looking for genuine partnership rather than psychological completion. This completeness created what Jung called the partnership paradox. Awakened men wanted relationships based on mutual growth, authentic communication, and spiritual connection, but they found that most potential partners were unconsciously seeking relationships based on need, projection, and psychological compensation. The very thing that made awakened men attractive, their emotional availability, psychological insight, and spiritual development, often attracted women who were unconsciously seeking healing or completion rather than genuine partnership. Can you relate to the experience of attracting people who seem drawn to your growth and stability, but who aren't interested in doing their own inner work or creating mutual development in the relationship? Jung observed that awakened men often experienced what he termed the healer's burden. They found themselves constantly attracting partners who were unconsciously seeking psychological healing or emotional rescue. Having developed empathy, emotional intelligence, and the ability to hold space for others' pain, these men naturally attracted wounded individuals. However, their awakened consciousness allowed them to see that taking on the role of healer or rescuer would ultimately serve neither partner's highest good and would recreate codependent patterns that they had worked to transcend. The third factor Jung identified was the awakened man's relationship with power and control. Men who had done deep psychological work had typically examined and integrated their shadow relationship with power, moving beyond both domination and submission into what Jung called authentic authority. They had learned to lead through service, to be strong without being controlling, and to maintain boundaries without being rigid. This psychological maturity often created incompatibility with partners who were still operating from power dynamics based on dominance and submission, seduction and manipulation, or victim and rescuer patterns. Jung's clinical work revealed that awakened men often found themselves unable to engage in the power games that many people mistook for passion or chemistry. They couldn't participate in push-pull dynamics, emotional manipulation, or the artificial creation of drama that many unconscious individuals required to feel alive in relationships. This led to relationships that felt flat or boring to partners who were addicted to the intensity of unconscious psychological drama, even though these relationships were actually healthier and more authentic. The loneliness that awakened men experienced wasn't just about difficulty finding partners, it was about the fundamental isolation that came from seeing reality more clearly than those around them. Jung called this the burden of consciousness, and he observed that it affected all areas of life, not just romantic relationships. Awakened men often found themselves unable to participate authentically in social interactions, professional dynamics, and family systems that were based on unconscious patterns they could no longer ignore. Jung discovered that this isolation was often intensified by the awakened man's relationship with his own sexuality. Having integrated his shadow and anima, he had typically moved beyond sexual expression based on conquest, validation seeking, or unconscious projection. His sexuality had become more conscious, more connected to genuine intimacy and spiritual connection. This often made casual sexual encounters feel empty or disconnected, while simultaneously making it difficult to find partners who shared his more integrated approach to sexual expression. Have you noticed that as you've grown psychologically and spiritually, many of the activities, relationships, and interactions that used to feel normal or exciting now feel superficial or even painful to participate in? The fourth factor Jung identified was the awakened man's relationship with authenticity and emotional expression. Men who had done deep inner work had typically developed the capacity for emotional honesty, vulnerability, and authentic self-expression that went beyond traditional masculine conditioning. However, they often found that this authenticity was threatening or uncomfortable for potential partners who were still operating from personas and psychological defenses. The awakened man's emotional availability and psychological insight could trigger anxiety in partners who weren't ready for genuine intimacy. Jung observed that awakened men often faced what he called the authenticity penalty. They were punished socially and romantically for the very qualities that represented psychological health and spiritual development. Their refusal to play unconscious games was interpreted as lack of passion. Their emotional maturity was seen as being too serious or intense. Their spiritual development was viewed as pretentious or unrealistic. This created a painful choice between authentic self-expression and social acceptance. The philosopher's analysis revealed that awakened men also struggled with what he termed the purpose gap. Having done deep work to discover their authentic life purpose and spiritual calling, they had typically aligned their lives around meaning and service rather than conventional success or social approval. This often created incompatibility with partners who were still seeking relationships based on security, status, or lifestyle achievement rather than shared purpose and spiritual growth. Jung's insight suggested that the solution to the awakened man's dilemma wasn't to lower standards or compromise authenticity, but to understand that their journey might require periods of solitude that were necessary for continued growth and service. He observed that some awakened men were called to what he termed the hermit path, a period of conscious solitude that allowed for deep spiritual development and creative expression that wouldn't be possible within conventional relationship structures. However, Jung also discovered that when awakened men did find compatible partners, the relationships that emerged were qualitatively different from typical romantic connections. These partnerships were based on mutual awakening, shared purpose, and spiritual intimacy that created depth and meaning far beyond conventional romantic satisfaction. The rarity of such connections explained why awakened men often remained single for extended periods. They were waiting not just for attraction or compatibility, but for genuine spiritual partnership. Subscribe to this channel if you're navigating the challenges of conscious living in an unconscious world and want to understand how psychological development affects relationships and life choices. Like this video if you believe that authentic growth sometimes requires sacrifice and solitude that leads to deeper fulfillment. Share this content with someone who's struggling to balance personal development with social connection and needs to understand they're not alone in this journey. Jung's analysis provided practical guidance for awakened men facing this dilemma. He suggested that understanding the psychological dynamics behind their isolation could help them navigate it more consciously. Rather than feeling defective or overly demanding, they could recognize that their standards weren't superficial preferences, but psychological necessities based on their level of development. This understanding could help them maintain self-compassion during periods of solitude, while remaining open to authentic connection when it appeared. The philosopher also emphasized that awakened men could use their periods of solitude for continued spiritual development, creative expression, and service to others. Rather than seeing singleness as failure or waiting, they could approach it as an opportunity for deeper self-discovery and contribution to collective consciousness. Jung observed that many awakened men were called to roles as teachers, healers, or artists that required the focus and energy that might not be available within conventional romantic partnerships. Jung's insights about awakened men and relationships also extended to understanding the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness was the painful experience of feeling disconnected and misunderstood, while solitude was the conscious choice to be alone for growth, creativity, and spiritual development. Awakened men could learn to transform loneliness into solitude by understanding their isolation as a natural consequence of their development rather than a personal failure. The practical application of Jung's insights suggested that awakened men needed to develop what he called spiritual patience, the capacity to wait for authentic connection rather than settling for relationships that required them to diminish their consciousness or authenticity. This patience wasn't passive waiting, but active development of their spiritual gifts and service to others while remaining open to partnership that aligned with their level of awakening. Jung also observed that awakened men could find community and connection through spiritual groups, men's work, and service activities that attracted others who were committed to conscious development. While these connections might not fulfill romantic needs, they could provide the understanding and support that helped navigate the challenges of conscious living in an unconscious world. Your own experience of finding relationships more challenging as you've grown spiritually and psychologically may be validation that you're on a path of authentic development that naturally creates selectivity in personal connections. Jung's insights suggest that this selectivity isn't a problem to be solved, but a natural consequence of psychological awakening that can be navigated with understanding, self-compassion, and trust in the process of authentic development. The ultimate insight from Jung's analysis of why awakened men often stay single is that consciousness creates both isolation and opportunity. Isolation from unconscious patterns and relationships, but opportunity for authentic connection, spiritual development, and service that wouldn't be possible from unconscious states. The loneliness is real and painful, but it's also purposeful, and ultimately leads to either profound partnership or meaningful solitude that serves both individual development and collective awakening. Jung's revolutionary understanding suggests that awakened men who find themselves single aren't failing at relationships, but succeeding at consciousness, and that success sometimes requires sacrifice, patience, and trust, that authentic development serves a purpose larger than personal satisfaction. The price of awakening is real, but so are the rewards of living authentically and contributing to collective consciousness through individual wholeness.